Commander Zixthara stood on the bridge of his warship, looking at the small human outpost ahead. The reptilian warrior had fought in many battles across the galaxy. His dark green scales bore the scars of 17 different wars. Today should have been easy. Intelligence reports said the humans at Kepler Station were weak and new to space warfare. The hegemony had been at war with humans for only 6 months. Most alien races surrendered quickly when faced with the mighty hegemony fleet. Humans were different, but Zixthara did not understand how different they truly were. "Sir, we are ready to attack," said his second-in-command, a young officer named Krultar. The bridge crew waited for orders. All of them expected another quick victory. Zixthara nodded. "Begin the assault. Standard formation. We will show these humans how real soldiers fight." His battalion of elite shock troops loaded into dropships. These were the best warriors the hegemony had. Each soldier had trained for years in proper combat techniques. They knew how to fight with honor and discipline. They followed the ancient rules of warfare that had served the hegemony for thousands of years. The dropships landed near Kepler Station. The mining outpost looked quiet and abandoned. Zixthara led his troops in perfect formation toward the main buildings. Everything seemed normal. Too normal. Captain Jake Morrison watched the alien soldiers through his scope. The human Marine had been waiting for 3 days in a hidden position. His face was covered with dirt and ash. Next to him, Sergeant Ben Tucker checked his explosives. "One more time. Look at them march in those pretty lines," Jake whispered into his radio. "Amy, you see the big one with all the fancy armor?" Lieutenant Amy Carter was hidden on a rooftop 200 meters away. Her sniper rifle was aimed at the alien commander. "I see him. Should I take the shot now?" "Not yet. Let them get closer to the welcome party." The hegemony soldiers marched forward with confidence. They expected the humans to meet them in open battle, soldier against soldier. That was how civilized beings fought wars. But the humans had other ideas. Ben Tucker had spent weeks turning the mining station into a maze of death. Every corridor had hidden bombs. Every room could become a trap. The humans had learned to fight dirty, and they were very good at it. The first explosion came from underneath the hegemony formation. Ben had buried mines in the ground days earlier. 6 alien soldiers disappeared in a cloud of smoke and metal. The perfect formation broke apart as soldiers dove for cover. "Now!" Jake shouted. Amy Carter's rifle cracked from the rooftop. The bullet hit a hegemony officer in the head. Before the aliens could locate her position, she was already moving to her next hiding spot. From all around the station, human soldiers opened fire. But they did not fight like the aliens expected. Instead of standing and shooting, they fired from hidden positions and then disappeared. They used the destroyed buildings as cover. They crawled through tunnels that Ben had dug under the station. Zixthara tried to organize his troops, but the humans made it impossible. Every time his soldiers found a human position, it was already empty. The humans moved like ghosts through their own destroyed base. "Sir, we cannot find them." Krelter shouted over the noise of battle. "They fight without honor. They hide like cowards." But Zixthara was beginning to understand that the humans were not cowards. They were something much more dangerous. They were desperate fighters who would do anything to win. Private Chris Morgan proved just how desperate humans could be. The young Marine was badly wounded and trapped in a corner by 3 hegemony soldiers. Instead of surrendering, he pulled the pin from a grenade and held it tight. "Come on!" he screamed at the aliens. "You want me? Come and get me." The hegemony soldiers backed away in shock. In all their wars, they had never seen an enemy willing to kill himself just to take a few enemies with him. Chris Morgan died in the explosion, but he took 2 alien soldiers with him. This was not how war was supposed to work. Soldiers were supposed to fight with honor, surrender when defeated, and follow the rules that kept warfare civilized. But Humans seemed to have no rules, except winning. Lieutenant Amy Carter moved through the station like a deadly shadow. She had grown up hunting in the forests of Earth. Now she hunted alien soldiers with the same cold patience. Her rifle claimed 7 more enemy officers before they even knew where the shots were coming from. Ben Tucker's demolition work turned the station into a nightmare for the hegemony forces. Corridors collapsed without warning. Rooms filled with poisonous gas. Floors gave way to reveal spikes below. The humans had turned their own home into a weapon. As the battle continued, Zeke-Thara watched his elite troops fall apart. These were warriors who had conquered star systems. They had broken the armies of a dozen different species. But the humans were breaking them with tactics that seemed to come from nightmares. The worst part was not the deaths, it was the fear. Hegemony soldiers began to jump at shadows. They shot at empty rooms. They refused to enter buildings that might be trapped. The humans were not just killing his soldiers. They were destroying their minds. Jake Morrison's voice echoed through the station's communication system. Attention! Alien forces, you are fighting on human territory now. We do not surrender. We do not retreat. We will make you pay for every step you take. The message was followed by recordings of wounded hegemony soldiers calling for help. The humans had somehow captured these sounds and were playing them back to terrorize the living soldiers. It was psychological warfare at its cruelest. By the end of the day, Zeke-Thara's battalion was in ruins. Of the 500 elite soldiers he had brought to Kepler Station, less than 200 were still able to fight. The rest were dead wounded, or too scared to continue. When reinforcements finally arrived, they found the station completely destroyed. The humans had blown up everything rather than let it fall into enemy hands. There were no prisoners to interrogate, no intelligence to gather. Just the bodies of hegemony soldiers and the echo of human laughter in the empty corridors. Zeke-Thara stood in the ruins of what had been the station's main building. His perfect armor was cracked and dirty. His elite troops looked like beaten recruits. For the first time in his long military career, he had truly lost a battle, but it was more than just a defeat. The humans had shown him something that would haunt his dreams for decades to come. They had revealed what happened when a species decided that survival was more important than honor, when winning mattered more than following the rules. As his ship left Kepler Station behind, Zeke-Thara stared at the wreckage below. Somewhere in that destruction, human voices had sung songs while they died. They had laughed while fighting impossible odds. They had turned their own deaths into weapons against their enemies. The commander did not know it yet, but his war against humanity had only just begun. And every battle would teach him new lessons about the terrifying creativity of desperate humans who refused to lose. 3 months after the disaster at Kepler Station, Zeke-Thara found himself standing before the High Command. The Great Council chamber was filled with the most powerful military leaders in the hegemony. Their reptilian faces showed no emotion. But Zeke-Thara could feel their disappointment. "Commander," spoke General Vorthek, the supreme leader of all hegemony forces. "Your failure at the mining station was unexpected, but we have a chance for you to redeem yourself." Zeke-Thara straightened his shoulders. "I am ready to serve, General." "Good. We are launching the largest assault in hegemony history. The target is New Geneva, humanity's fortress world in the Centauri system. You will lead the ground forces." The hologram that appeared in the center of the room showed a green and blue planet. It looked peaceful and beautiful. But Zeke-Thara had learned not to trust appearances when it came to humans. "Intelligence reports suggest the humans have 500,000 civilians on the planet," continued General Vorthak. "They also have significant military forces. We will deploy orbital bombardment ships, atmospheric processors, and 800,000 troops. This time, overwhelming force will break human resistance." Zeke-Thara nodded, but inside he felt uneasy. He remembered the laughter of dying humans at Kepler Station. He remembered how they had turned their own deaths into weapons. Something told him that New Geneva would be different from any battle the hegemony had ever fought. 2 weeks later, the massive hegemony fleet arrived at New Geneva. Zixthara stood on the bridge of his command ship, watching the planet through the view screen. It looked exactly like the intelligence reports described. Cities dotted the continents. Farms spread across the valleys. Everything seemed normal. General Lisa Brooks stood in the command bunker deep beneath New Geneva's capital city. The human officer had fought in the first human space war 20 years earlier. Her gray hair was pulled back in a tight knot. Her blue eyes were cold as winter ice. "Colonel Adams," she said to the man standing beside her. "Are the preparations complete?" Colonel Pete Adams nodded. "Every civilian has been moved to the deep shelters. The surface cities are empty except for our troops. The welcome party is ready." Lisa smiled, but it was not a happy smile. "Then let's show these aliens what happens when they threaten human children." The hegemony bombardment began at dawn. Massive energy beams struck the planet's surface from orbit. Cities burned. Forests turned to ash. The humans seemed to offer no resistance as their world was destroyed from space. After 3 days of bombardment, Zixthara received the order to land his troops. The dropships descended through smoke and ash as his boots touched the ground. Of New Geneva, Zixthara thought the battle was already won. The orbital bombardment had turned the surface into a wasteland. He was wrong. The first sign of trouble came when Major Kate Sullivan's engineering teams began their work. Hidden charges exploded throughout the ruined cities. Buildings that had survived the bombardment collapsed into carefully planned rubble piles. Streets became impassable canyons. The humans had turned their own destroyed cities into elaborate mazes designed to trap and kill enemy soldiers. "Sir," reported Captain Kesvar over the radio, "we are taking heavy casualties in Sector 7. The humans have turned the rubble into a fortress." Zixthara studied his tactical display. Red markers showed where his troops were under attack. The pattern made no sense. The humans seemed to be everywhere and nowhere at the same time. That night, Captain Ron Hayes led his unit in the first of many terror raids on hegemony camps. The human soldiers had painted their faces with ashes from their burned cities. They moved through the darkness like ancient spirits of war. Hayes and his men struck at supply convoys first. They would appear from hidden tunnels, destroy everything they could, and disappear before reinforcements arrived. But it was not just the attacks that bothered the alien soldiers. It was the sounds the humans made. They howled like wild animals as they fought. They sang songs in their strange language while they killed. They laughed when they were wounded. The psychological effect on the hegemony troops was devastating. Zixthara tried to maintain discipline among his forces, but the human tactics were unlike anything in the hegemony military manuals. Traditional responses did not work against enemies who seemed to welcome death. The breaking point came during the 3rd week of the siege. Sergeant Julie Foster's propaganda unit had somehow learned the hegemony funeral songs. They broadcast these sacred melodies from hidden speakers throughout the ruins, but they had changed the words. Instead of honoring the dead, the songs now mocked them. The effect on hegemony morale was immediate and terrible. Soldiers who heard their most sacred traditions, turned into weapons of psychological warfare, began to break down mentally. Some refused to leave their positions. Others fired at shadows and empty buildings. "They are demons," whispered one young hegemony soldier to his squad leader. "They fight like demons from the old stories." But humans were not demons. They were something that frightened Zixthara even more. They were a species that had learned to weaponize their own suffering. Every wound became a tool of war. Every death was turned into psychological ammunition against their enemies. Lieutenant Commander Nina Parker proved this point when her unit was surrounded in the ruins of what had been New Geneva's central library. Instead of surrendering, She ordered her soldiers to collect the bodies of fallen hegemony troops. They arranged these bodies in ritual patterns that the humans had somehow learned were sacred to the hegemony religion. When hegemony reinforcements arrived, they found their dead comrades displayed in a mockery of their most holy ceremonies. The psychological damage was worse than losing 100 soldiers in battle. The siege continued for 2 more months. Every day brought new horrors as the humans found new ways to turn warfare into psychological torture. They used their own wounded as bait for traps. They played recordings of captured hegemony officers begging for mercy. They seemed to know exactly which buttons to push to drive their enemies to madness. Private Danny Reed was just 19 years old when he made his final stand in a collapsed shopping center. Surrounded by 20 hegemony soldiers, he could have surrendered. Instead, he activated the experimental explosive device that Colonel Adams had given to volunteers. The explosion created a crater 50 meters wide. It killed Danny and all 20 alien soldiers. But more importantly, it sent a message that echoed across the battlefield. The humans would rather die than give up. They would take their enemies with them into death, and they would smile while doing it. As the siege dragged on, Zixthara began to understand something terrible. The humans were not just fighting to defend their planet. They were fighting to prove a point. They wanted the hegemony to understand that attacking humanity meant accepting costs that no sane species would be willing to pay. When New Geneva finally fell, it was not because the humans were defeated. It was because there was nothing left to defend. The humans had destroyed everything themselves rather than let it fall into enemy hands. They had turned their own beautiful world into a graveyard, just to make their enemies pay the highest possible price for victory. Standing in the ruins of New Geneva's capital, Zixthara looked at the cost of victory. His 800,000 troops had been reduced to less than 400,000. The survivors were traumatized and broken. They had won the planet, but the humans had won something more important. They had won fear. For the first time in hegemony history, their soldiers were afraid to fight an enemy. The humans had shown them that some species would go to any length to protect what they loved. They had turned war itself into a weapon that wounded not just the body, but the soul. Zixthara stood alone in the ash and rubble, listening to the wind blow through the destroyed city. Somewhere in that wind, he could still hear the echo of human laughter, the sound of soldiers who had found joy in their own destruction as long as it hurt their enemies. The victory at New Geneva felt hollow. The hegemony had learned to fear an enemy that could not be broken, only killed. And even in death, the humans had found a way to keep fighting. The war ended on a Tuesday. Zixthara received the news while sitting in his quarters aboard the command ship. After 18 months of fighting, both sides had simply run out of soldiers to throw at each other. The ceasefire agreement was signed. In neutral space, witnessed by 3 other galactic powers who were terrified that the human hegemony war might spread. But for Zixthara, the war would never truly end. He returned to his homeworld as a decorated hero. The hegemony government gave him medals and honors. They held parades in his name. Citizens cheered when they saw him walking through the capital city. But none of them understood what he had really seen during the war. The nightmare started on his first night back home. In his dreams, he saw Private Chris Morgan holding that grenade, smiling as he chose death over surrender. He heard the laughter of human soldiers as they turned their own bodies into weapons. He remembered the sound of Nina Parker singing while she piloted her ship directly into a hegemony cruiser. Zixthara tried to explain to other officers what the humans were really like. But his words never seemed enough. How could he describe the look in a human's eyes when they decided to die rather than lose? How could he make them understand that humans had turned love itself into the most dangerous weapon in the galaxy? They fought without honor, said General Vorthak during one of their meetings, but we still won. The humans learned to respect hegemony power. Zixthura wanted to laugh, but he was too tired. The hegemony had not won anything. They had simply survived. Their first contact with a species that redefined what war could be. The humans had not learned to respect hegemony power. They had taught the hegemony to fear human desperation. The peace negotiations took place on a space station near the border between human and hegemony territory. Zixthara was there as a military advisor, watching the diplomats try to create a lasting peace. The human delegation was led by Ambassador Dale Cooper, a calm man with kind eyes and a gentle voice. But Zixthara was not fooled by the ambassador's peaceful appearance. He had learned to look deeper when dealing with humans. Behind Cooper's kind smile was the same steel that had driven human soldiers to impossible sacrifices. The humans had not changed. They were just pointing their deadly determination in a different direction. General Helen Wade was also part of the human delegation. She had fought at the Battle of Titan Station, where human forces had held off a hegemony fleet 10 times their size. When she spoke about mutual cooperation and shared futures, Zixthara heard something else entirely. He heard the voice of a species that would do anything to protect their own. The peace treaty was signed with great ceremony. Both sides agreed to respect each other's territory. They promised to work together for galactic stability. They spoke of friendship and understanding between their peoples. But Zixthara knew the truth. The peace existed because the hegemony was afraid to find out what other horrors humanity might unleash in another war. Sleep became impossible for the commander. Every night brought new dreams of human warfare. He saw Corporal Steve Allen's face as the human triggered explosives that buried an entire hegemony regiment. He remembered Lieutenant Rachel Green fighting with her own severed arm after losing it to shrapnel. The humans had weaponized their own mortality, and the memory of it would not leave him alone. His wife, Zixthara, tried to help him. She brought him the traditional medicines that were supposed to calm a warrior's mind after battle. She arranged for him to speak with the religious leaders who normally helped soldiers deal with the memories of war. Nothing worked. "You must forget the war," she told him one evening as they sat together in their garden. "It is over now. We have peace." Zixthara looked at his wife's gentle face and tried to find the words to explain. "The war is not over for me. It lives inside my head. I close my eyes and I see them. I hear their voices. They haunt me not because they were evil, but because they were something I never thought possible." "What do you mean?" "They were a species that could turn love into the ultimate weapon. Every human soldier I fought loved something more than their own life. They fought so hard because they were protecting what they loved. That kind of love is more dangerous than any weapon the hegemony has ever built." Zixthara did not understand, and Zixthara could not blame her. She had never seen humans fight. She had never watched them choose death over defeat. She had never witnessed the terrible beauty of beings who could transform their own destruction into victory. Years passed, but the memories remained fresh. Zixthara was promoted to a position in the hegemony high command, but he found no joy in his success. He attended meetings where younger officers discussed military strategy, and he wanted to warn them about the humans. But how could he explain what he had learned? The humans were not just another species that could be conquered or intimidated. They were something entirely different. They were a people who had learned to weaponize their own emotions. Fear, love, desperation, hope, all of these became tools of war in human hands. One day, Zixthara received a message from Colonel Frank Lewis, a human officer who had fought at New Geneva. The message was simple: "Commander, I hope you are well. I wanted you to know that we remember you as an honorable enemy. If you ever visit human space, you would be welcome as a guest." The kindness in the message made Zixthara's blood run cold. This was the same species that had turned psychological warfare into an art form. The same beings who had laughed while dying just to break their enemies' spirits. and now they were offering friendship to the very soldiers they had once terrorized. That night, Zixthara finally understood why the war haunted him so deeply. It was not just the memories of death and destruction. It was the realization that humanity's greatest strength was also their greatest gift. The same fierce love that made them terrifying enemies could make them the most loyal allies in the universe. The humans had not been corrupted by war. They had simply revealed their true nature. They were a species that would do absolutely anything to protect what they loved. During the war, that love had been turned against the hegemony. Now in peace, that same love was being offered to their former enemies. Zixthara sat in his study, looking at a star chart that showed both human and hegemony space. The borders between their territories were clearly marked, but he knew those lines meant nothing. The real boundary was not in space. It was in the human heart, where they decided who deserved their protection and who deserved their wrath. For the first time since the war ended, Zixthara felt something other than fear. When he thought about humans, he felt a strange kind of hope. If beings capable of such terrible warfare could choose peace, then perhaps there was a chance for real understanding between their species. But even as hope grew in his heart, the nightmares continued. In his dreams, he still heard human soldiers singing as they died. He still saw their faces, painted with ash and blood, laughing in the face of impossible odds. The memories would never leave him, but perhaps that was good. Perhaps the galaxy needed beings who remembered what humans were capable of when they chose to love something more than their own lives. The war was over, but its lessons would echo through the stars forever. Humanity had taught the galaxy that love, not hate, was the most dangerous force in the universe. And Zixthara would carry that terrible knowledge with him until the day he died. 20 years after the last shot was fired in the human hegemony war, Zixthara stood in front of a classroom filled with young hegemony officers. His scales had turned silver with age, and his once powerful frame had grown thin. But his eyes still held the sharp intelligence that had made him one of the greatest military minds in hegemony history. The students listened as he taught them about modern warfare tactics. They took notes on his lessons about supply lines and orbital bombardment strategies. They studied his famous victories from the early days of his career. But they had no idea about the war that had changed everything for their teacher. "Professor," Zixthara asked a young officer named Keflen, "the curriculum mentions the human hegemony conflict, but we never study it in detail. Why is that?" Zixthara paused at the question. The official military history book said very little about the war with humanity. Most records had been classified or quietly forgotten. The hegemony high command preferred to pretend the war had never been as bad as it really was. "The war with humanity was different from our other conflicts," Zixthara said carefully. "It taught us lessons that are difficult to put into textbooks." The students waited for him to continue, but Zixthara simply moved on to the next topic. How could he tell them about Private Chris Morgan's final grenade? How could he explain the sound of human laughter echoing through the ruins of New Geneva? Some lessons were too dangerous to teach in a classroom. That afternoon, Zixthara received a message that would change everything. The Hegemony Military Academy was hosting joint training exercises with human forces. As one of the senior instructors, he would be required to work with human officers to demonstrate peaceful cooperation between former enemies. The irony was not lost on him. After 20 years of trying to forget the war, he would be forced to face the descendants of the very soldiers who had haunted his dreams. 3 weeks later, Zixthara found himself on a space station orbiting the neutral world of Kepler Prime. Human and hegemony officers worked side by side, planning training exercises that would show the galaxy how former enemies could become allies. General Paul Mitchell led the human delegation. He was a calm, professional officer who spoke about tactical cooperation and shared security goals. But Zixthara saw something familiar in the human's eyes. It was the same quiet determination that had made human soldiers so terrifying during the war. "Commander Zixthara," General Mitchell said during their first meeting, "I've read your military record. You're quite famous among human military historians. Your defense of the Rigel system was brilliant." Zixthara nodded politely, but inside he felt cold. The humans had studied his tactics. They knew how he thought, how he fought. Even in peace, they were gathering intelligence. The joint training exercises began the next day. Zixthara watched young human soldiers like Lieutenant Sam Brown and Sergeant Mary Clark work alongside hegemony troops. The cooperation was real and impressive. But underneath the friendly surface, Zixthara could see the same tactical brilliance that had nearly destroyed his civilization. Captain Tony Ward gave a presentation on proportional response to mixed groups of human and alien officers. His voice was calm and reasonable as he discussed humanitarian concerns and rules of engagement. But Zixthara heard something else in that voice. It was the same tone that could order total destruction if circumstances required it. During a break in the exercises, Zixthara found himself alone with Major Ellen Murphy, a human logistics officer. She was discussing supply chain management with the same careful attention to detail that her predecessors had used to plan the defense of New Geneva. "Major," Zixthara said quietly, "do you ever think about what your people did during the war?" Ellen looked at him with curious eyes. "Which war, Commander?" "Humans have fought many wars. The war between our species. The things that happened at places like Kepler Station and New Geneva." Ellen was quiet for a moment. Then she smiled, but it was a sad smile. "Commander, every human military officer studies that war. We learn from it, we remember it. But we try to make sure it never happens again. And if it did happen again, if someone threatened what you loved." The question hung in the air between them. Ellen's expression did not change, but something shifted in her eyes. For just a moment, Zixthara saw the same steel that had driven human soldiers to impossible sacrifices. "Then we would do whatever it took to protect our people," she said simply, "just like any species would." But Zixthara knew that was not true. Not every species would go as far as humans had gone. Not every people could turn their own love into a weapon that could break the spirit of their enemies. That evening, there was a formal dinner for all the officers participating in the exercises. Humans and hegemony personnel sat together, sharing stories and building the friendships that were supposed to ensure lasting peace. Zixthara sat next to Colonel Frank Lewis, the same human officer who had sent him that message years earlier. Frank was older now, with gray hair and lines around his eyes. But he still had the quiet strength that marked all human veterans. "Commander," Frank said as they ate, "I've been wanting to ask you something for 20 years. What is that? Do you ever regret the war? Do you wish it had never happened?" Zixthara thought about the question for a long time. He remembered the nightmares, the years of sleepless nights, the weight of memories that had never left him. But he also thought about what the war had taught him. "No," he said finally, "I do not regret it." Frank looked surprised. "Why not?" "Because it showed me what your species truly is. During the war, I thought you were monsters. I thought you had been corrupted by violence and desperation. But I was wrong." "What do you mean?" Zixthara turned to look at the human colonel. "You were not corrupted by the war. You were revealed by it. The same love that made you terrible enemies has made you the most loyal allies the galaxy has ever seen." Frank was quiet for a moment. Then he asked, "How do you know we won't change? How do you know we won't become your enemies again?" "Because I understand now what drives your species. You do not fight for conquest or glory. You fight to protect what you love. And somehow, impossibly, you have chosen to love your former enemies." The realization hit Zixthara like a revelation. The humans had not just offered peace to the hegemony. They had extended their protection to include their former enemies. The same fierce love that had made them willing to die rather than surrender was now being used to guard hegemony space from other threats. Later that night, Zixthara stood alone on the observation deck, looking out at the stars. For the first time in 20 years, he felt at peace. The nightmares would probably never completely go away. He would always remember the sound of human war cries and the sight of soldiers who chose death over defeat. But now he understood what those memories really meant. He had not been witnessing the destruction of civilization. He had been seeing the birth of something new. The humans had shown the galaxy that love could be the most powerful force in the universe when it was properly directed. The war had ended not with surrender, but with transformation. The hegemony had learned to fear human determination. But more importantly, they had learned to trust human loyalty. The same species that could turn their own deaths into weapons could also turn their lives into shields for others. Zixthara smiled as he watched the stars. Somewhere out there, human patrol ships were keeping the space lane safe. Human soldiers were standing guard over worlds that had once been their enemies. Human scientists were working to heal the wounds that war had left on both civilizations. Memories of war would always be with him. But now they carried a different meaning. They were not just reminders of horror and loss. They were proof that even the most terrible conflicts could lead to something beautiful. They were evidence that love, not hate, was the force that truly shaped the universe. In his dreams that night, Zixthara still heard the voices of human soldiers. But instead of war cries, he heard them singing lullabies to hegemony children. Instead of preparing for battle, he saw them building schools and hospitals. The same hands that had once held weapons were now offering help to anyone who needed it. The war was finally over, not just in the official records, but in the heart of the commander who had survived it. And in its place was something that neither species had expected, a peace built not on fear, but on understanding. A friendship forged in the fires of conflict and strengthened by the knowledge that some bonds could never be broken. Zixthara slept peacefully for the first time in 20 years, knowing that somewhere in the darkness, human sentries stood watch over his people's dreams.